The ocean was oddly serene for a Tuesday, with barely a ripple in sight. Ray had taken his modest fishing vessel a bit farther offshore than he normally did. Not in search of fish, but for solitude. 2 years had passed since he lost his wife, and retirement from the Navy had slowed his life to a crawl, each day blending into the next with silent repetition. That morning, as he reeled in another line void of any catch, something unusual caught his attention. A movement on the water, larger than a seal, yet smoother than a dolphin. He shielded his eyes from the sun and stared, his heart missing a beat when the shape started moving directly toward his boat. Initially, Ray assumed it was an illusion, maybe drifting debris or a marine creature that had strayed off course. But as the figure came closer, it revealed a golden, unmistakable form. A lioness. Her head bobbed just above the water, eyes wide and full of exhaustion, and what looked almost like desperation. Salt water poured from her snout, her movements heavy, fatigued, yet determined. Ray's body froze. A lioness was swimming in open sea, straight toward him. His instincts screamed for him to start the engine and get away from the approaching predator. But her gaze held him rooted. There was no menace in her eyes, no panic. There was something sorrowful, an unspoken plea. She was struggling now, her front legs smacking the waves weakly, barely able to keep her head above water. This shouldn't have been real. And yet she swam forward, as if Ray were her final hope. He reached for the radio, but it buzzed only with static. He'd meant to fix it for months. His phone had no reception this far from land. It was just him, his aging fishing boat, and a drowning lioness locking eyes with him. When she finally reached the side of the hull, she didn't roar or growl. She merely raised one large paw and placed it gently against the edge of the boat. Ray held his breath, watching in disbelief. She wasn't attacking. She was asking for help. Unsure of how to respond, he moved slowly. His military training had prepared him for countless emergencies, but nothing remotely like this. The lioness tried hoisting herself up, claws scraping along the boat's side, producing a harsh screech that made Ray wince. Her body trembled violently, soaked fur hanging heavy, strength draining from her limbs. Ray realized that if he didn't intervene, she would vanish beneath the waves forever. And strangely, he couldn't bear that idea. With shaking hands, he dropped a rope ladder over the side, uncertain if she'd know what to do. She glanced at it, then at him, and made another attempt. This time, she pushed with her entire body. The ladder swung, the boat tipped dangerously, and Ray watched breathless as she climbed aboard, like something pulled from the pages of a myth. She collapsed on the deck immediately, panting, fur glistening with salt, steam rising in the early sun. Ray stood frozen, unable to move or even blink. The lioness lay motionless, her chest rising and falling quickly, her ribs visible beneath her soaked coat. Blood darkened one leg, though Ray couldn't determine the source. Slowly, he stepped back and grabbed an old towel, some water, anything that might help, still half expecting her to spring at him. But she remained still, completely depleted. His thoughts turned to Marie, his late wife, and the whimsical stories she used to write about incredible animals and unlikely bonds. She would have already given the lioness a name. She would have known what to do. Ray knelt a few feet away, gently sliding a bowl of water forward. The lioness sniffed it before beginning to drink greedily, spilling water across the deck. Her eyes never left his. The morning grew warmer, but Ray couldn't shake the chill along his spine. He had no explanation for what he was witnessing. He had no idea where she'd come from or how long she'd been swimming. All he knew was that this moment, as impossible and delicate as it seemed, was happening. As sunlight danced across the sea, Ray sat beside a half-drowned lioness on his fishing boat, knowing in his gut that life would never be the same. He reached for the radio again, hoping for a miracle signal. Just then, the lioness let out a low, haunting sound, more of a moan than a growl. It echoed across the empty ocean like a sacred lament. And in that sound, Ray heard something clear. Someone had left her to die, and now, for reasons he couldn't fathom, she had chosen him to survive. He looked at her, soaking wet, injured, out of place, and struggled to accept what they were now. A full-grown predator lay on his deck. yet she wasn't threatening. She was vulnerable, broken, moving with caution. He approached again, carrying a bucket of fresh water. He poured some near her mouth. Her eyes flicked open. No rage, no alarm, just weariness. And maybe trust. Ray had lived most of his life identifying danger before it struck. This wasn't that. This was a creature who had reached the end of her strength and was barely hanging on. Now he noticed a wound, deep, raw, just above her front leg. It looked like it came from a man-made weapon, maybe a harpoon. A new weight settled in his chest. She hadn't ended up here by chance. Someone had harmed her, abandoned her, left her to drown. It was more than neglect. It was monstrous. And now, somehow, she was his responsibility. Ray searched the storage hatch and pulled out an old roll of gauze from a long-forgotten first aid kit. Carefully, he inched closer, letting her catch his scent. She didn't flinch. Gently, he pressed the gauze against her wound. She trembled at the contact, but didn't lash out. She endured. Ray had seen that look before, in the faces of wounded soldiers and grieving widows. It was the face of someone who had already survived more than they should have. Ray realized he had a choice to make. He could head back, report her, and let authorities deal with it. They'd likely tranquilize her, cage her, euthanize her. Or he could wait, stabilize her, trust the instincts that had carried him through wars, through storms, and through the death of the only person he ever loved. He looked into her eyes again. She didn't need confinement. She needed a chance. The radio crackled suddenly, a fleeting tease of reception, but nothing came through. Ray sighed and slumped into his chair, glancing once more at the lioness. She had shifted slightly, curling tighter, her tail twitching faintly. The sight of so much strength folded into such fragility felt surreal. "You and me both, huh?" he muttered. It was the first time he'd spoken aloud in days. By afternoon, the wind picked up, and Ray knew he had to act before the weather worsened. The marina was too far. Instead, he steered toward an old Navy supply dock, no longer in use. It offered some privacy, shelter. As he turned the wheel, the lioness stirred but didn't resist. She followed his every movement with her eyes. Somehow, she knew he wasn't fleeing. He was protecting her. Ray wondered how he'd explain this to anyone. What could he say? That a lioness had been drowning and came to him for help? No one would believe it. They'd think he'd lost his mind. But it didn't matter. She was real. Her pain was real. And now, her survival depended on him. He dropped anchor just before sunset behind a cluster of rocky cliffs that concealed them. The lioness hadn't moved much, but her breathing had become more even. Ray spread out a tarp, more water, and the rest of his bait fish in case. She was hungry. He kept his distance, not from fear, but from reverence. She hadn't chosen this fate, but she had chosen him. As night fell and stars scattered across the sky, Ray sat beside the hatch, watching her slow, rhythmic breathing. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. There was something ancient and sacred in her presence. He wasn't just trying to save an animal. He was standing between cruelty and mercy, abandonment and a second chance. And he had already made his decision. At dawn, Ray awoke to an unfamiliar sound. Steady breathing, just feet away. The lioness had moved during the night, curling up near him, her head resting beside the bench where he'd kept watch. There was no threat in her closeness, just a quiet trust. He remained still, afraid to shatter the fragile moment. Her wound looked slightly better. Not healed, but no longer bleeding. She had eaten some fish, drank the water. Ray crouched beside her and replaced the bandages slowly and gently. She allowed it. No resistance, no growl, just calm observation. "You're not just surviving anymore," he whispered. "You're fighting." And she was. Later, a drone buzzed overhead, probably from a yacht or beach patrol. Ray cursed under his breath and quickly pulled a tarp over her, hoping the footage wouldn't give them away. He knew they were running out of time. A lion couldn't stay hidden forever, even at sea. That night, Ray called an old Navy buddy who worked private security for a coastal wildlife sanctuary. He didn't explain much, just said he had a wounded animal in urgent need. There was a pause before the man answered. "Bring her," I won't ask anything until you get here. Hands trembling, Ray ended the call. He knew the risk, but this was their only hope. By morning, Ray had fashioned a shaded space and a makeshift sling to keep her safe during transit. Miraculously, the lioness climbed it herself with one last effort. She was adapting. She wanted to live. Ray started the engine. The boat rumbled to life, and they sailed north, the coastline unraveling beside them like a silent promise. As they traveled, Ray spoke to her. He told her about Marie, about the silence that followed her death. The lioness listened in her own way, ears flicking, eyes blinking slowly. Sometimes, she raised her head when he paused. It felt strange, and yet completely natural. Two survivors adrift in a world that had forgotten what to do with them. Midway through the trip, a storm rolled in. Wind battered the boat, rain lashed the windows, and waves tossed them sideways. Ray fought to stay on course. He kept checking on her, afraid she might panic. But she stayed low and focused, as if trusting him to guide them through. That trust became his anchor. Just before dusk, they reached a hidden dock. Soaked and exhausted, Ray's friend was waiting, and stunned silent when he saw what climbed off the boat, limping but upright. "Jesus, Ray," he whispered. Ray simply nodded, too drained to speak. Together, they walked the lioness through a wooded path to a concealed enclosure, vast, peaceful, rich with trees and fresh water. A place to heal, a place to be free. At the gate, she stopped beside Ray, looked at him deeply. In that instant, he didn't see gratitude. He saw understanding, recognition. She stepped forward, then turned back for a final glance, her silent goodbye, before disappearing into the trees. Ray didn't speak for a long time. He stood in silence, heart full. He hadn't just saved her. He had been saved, too. Ray stayed at the sanctuary for a few more days. Not because anyone asked him to, but because leaving felt premature, like walking away from something sacred before it had finished revealing its purpose. He spent his time helping the caretakers reinforce the fencing, lay out clean water lines, and carry meat into the feeding zones, all while keeping an eye on the forested enclosure at the far edge, where the lioness was recovering in privacy. They hadn't named her yet. The staff offered ideas: Asha, Mara, Celine, each one carrying beautiful meanings from different languages. But Ray shook his head. "She already has a name," he said quietly. "We just don't know it yet." Every afternoon, he sat on a weathered bench just outside her enclosure. She wouldn't always show herself, but sometimes, especially near dusk, he'd see the glint of her eyes between the trees, watching him, not lurking, not stalking, simply being there, present. He found it comforting. Her presence grounded him more than anything else had in years. One evening, just as the sun began bleeding gold across the horizon, the lioness emerged. Slowly, carefully. Her limp was still visible, but less severe now. The wounds were healing, externally at least. She walked along the edge of the enclosure until she reached the fence. Ray stood up, heart quickening. They stared at each other again. That same silent conversation. She pressed her forehead against the wire fence. Ray hesitated, then did the same, leaning gently, not quite touching but close enough to feel her breath on the other side. "You made it," he whispered. Her eyes blinked slowly. A silent response. A month passed. Ray didn't go back to sea. His boat sat docked untouched. Instead, he found himself returning to the sanctuary daily, then working there part-time. The staff welcomed him without question. His knowledge, his calm presence, his quiet discipline. He brought something to the place they hadn't realized they were missing. Stability. Heart. But no one questioned the lioness's bond with him. No one else could get as close. No one else could touch her. When she needed her medicine, Ray administered it. When she refused food, Ray sat beside her and coaxed her to eat, like a grieving father feeding a sick child. They called her Nia, eventually, Swahili for purpose. Ray liked that, because she had one. And maybe so did he. One chilly morning in early winter, Ray arrived before dawn. Fog clung to the sanctuary grounds like smoke. He walked the familiar gravel path toward Nia's enclosure and paused when he saw her already waiting by the fence. her golden fur ghost-like in the mist. He approached slowly, smiling. "You're early," he said. Then he noticed her posture. Not weak, not sick, just different, calmer, still, as if waiting for something. He sat on the bench, and for the first time, she lay down near him, just on the other side of the fence, her head on her paws, eyes on the horizon, not on him, not watching for danger. She was at peace. Ray leaned back, let out a long breath. He had stopped asking why this had happened, why a lioness had chosen to save her, why she had trusted him when she should have feared him. Life didn't always give answers. Sometimes it gave people, or creatures, or moments. Nia sighed deeply. Ray closed his eyes and sat with her. And in that quiet, something inside him healed. Not all at once, not like a miracle, but like a scar softening. By spring, she no longer limped. By summer, she roamed her entire enclosure, leaping, stretching, running. By fall, Ray could walk inside the enclosure beside her. No fence, no barrier, no fear, just trust. One day, a news team came to the sanctuary to film a story about the rescued animals. When they asked about Nia, the director pointed at Ray. "Ask him," she said. "He's the reason she's alive." The reporter approached him, microphone in hand. "What made you take her in? What made you help a predator like that, alone at sea?" Ray looked out over the trees, toward the place where Nia was basking in the sun. He didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, "She wasn't just a predator. She was a survivor. Like me." He paused. "You don't get to choose who washes up in your life, but you do get to choose whether you let them drown." The reporter blinked, unsure how to respond. Ray offered a kind smile, tipped his cap, and walked away. That evening, as the sun fell below the trees, Ray sat beside Nia again. Her head rested in the grass. His hand brushed her mane gently. They didn't need words. They were each other's miracle. And somewhere beyond reason, beyond science or logic, they both knew they had saved each other.